Grace Martinez was counting her last $20 bill when she heard the whimpering. Her two children, 8-year-old Maya and 6-year-old Lucas, had stopped dead in their tracks on the cracked sidewalk, their worn backpacks sliding off their shoulders as they stared into the shadowy alley beside Murphy's Corner store. The sound was heart-wrenching, a desperate plea that seemed to echo off the brick walls and pierce straight through to their souls. Little did Grace know that this moment, this single act of compassion with nothing but a sock and some first aid tape, would lead them to a discovery that would change their lives forever. What they found in that abandoned cabin deep in the woods would prove that sometimes the most broken things can lead us to the greatest treasures. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The October wind cut through Grace's thin jacket as she hurried to catch up with her children, her mind already calculating how she would stretch their meager grocery budget for the rest of the week. At 32, she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had seen better days, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked multiple jobs just to keep, quote, the lights on? The divorce had been finalized 8 months ago, and every day since then had been a careful balancing act between pride and desperation. "Mom, look," Maya whispered, her voice trembling with concern as she pointed toward the source of the pitiful sounds. There, huddled behind a overturned trash can, was a medium-sized dog with matted brown and white fur. Its right front paw was held awkwardly in the air, and even from a distance, Grace could see the animal was in considerable pain. The dog's eyes, a striking amber color that seemed to glow in the dim light of the alley, met hers with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Lucas, ever the tender-hearted one, took a step forward, but Grace instinctively reached out to hold him back. "Careful, sweetheart. We don't know if it's friendly," she said softly, though her own heart was already breaking at the sight of the suffering animal. The dog couldn't have been more than 2 years old, and despite its obvious distress, there was something gentle about its demeanor that immediately put her at ease. "But, Mom, it's hurt," Maya said, her voice carrying the kind of moral certainty that only children possess. "We have to help it." She had inherited her mother's compassionate nature, along with her stubborn streak, and Grace could see the determination building in her daughter's dark eyes. Grace knelt down slowly, making herself less threatening as she extended her hand toward the injured animal. "Hey there, sweet thing," she said, in the soothing voice she used when one of her children had a nightmare. "What happened to you?" The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, and Grace took it as a good sign. She had always been good with animals, a trait that had served her well during her brief stint as a veterinary assistant before the kids were born. As she moved closer, the extent of the dog's injury became clear. Its paw was swollen and had what appeared to be a deep cut across the pad, likely from broken glass or sharp metal. The wound wasn't bleeding heavily, but it was clearly infected, and the animal was probably in significant pain. Grace's heart sank as she realized the extent of care the dog would need, care that would require money she simply didn't have. "We should take it to the vet," Lucas said, his 6-year-old logic making perfect sense in his innocent world where solutions were always within reach. Grace felt the familiar knot form in her stomach, the one that appeared whenever her children asked for something she couldn't provide. "Honey, vet visits cost a lot of money," she said gently, hating herself for having to explain financial limitations to someone so young. "But maybe there's something we can do to help right now." She looked around the alley, her mind racing through possibilities. In her purse, she had a small first aid kit that she'd started carrying after Lucas had scraped his knee at the playground the previous month. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Maya, can you reach into my purse and get the little white box?" she asked, never taking her eyes off the dog, who was now watching her with what seemed like understanding. Maya rummaged through the worn leather purse, past the stack of unpaid bills and the nearly empty wallet, until she found the compact first aid kit. "Got it, Mom," she said, handing it over with the solemnity of someone participating in a medical procedure. Grace opened the kit and assessed its contents. A few adhesive bandages, some antiseptic wipes, medical tape, and a small tube of antibiotic ointment. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She looked down at her feet, where she was wearing the thick wool socks her mother had knitted for her last Christmas. Without hesitation, she slipped off her right shoe and peeled off the sock. "Mom, what are you doing?" Lucas asked, his eyes wide with curiosity and concern. "I'm going to make a bandage," Grace explained, her voice steady despite the uncertainty she felt. "This sock will help protect the wound until the dog can get proper medical care." She had no idea if the animal belonged to someone or if it was truly a stray, but in that moment, ownership didn't matter. What mattered was the suffering creature in front of her. Moving slowly and speaking in gentle tones, Grace approached the dog. To her amazement, the animal didn't try to escape or show any signs of aggression. Instead, it seemed to sense her intentions and remained still, its amber eyes fixed on her face with an almost human-like intelligence. "That's a good dog," she murmured, carefully examining the injured paw. The cut was deeper than she had initially thought, and the swelling indicated that the injury was several days old. Grace cleaned the wound as best she could with the antiseptic wipes, her heart aching as the dog whimpered softly but made no attempt to pull away. The trust the animal was showing her was both humbling and heartbreaking. "Is it going to be okay?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she watched her mother work. "I think so," Grace replied, though she wasn't entirely sure. She applied a generous amount of antibiotic ointment to the wound, then carefully wrapped her wool sock around the injured paw. The makeshift bandage wasn't perfect, but it would provide some protection and help keep the wound clean. She secured it with medical tape, making sure it wasn't too tight but would stay in place. As she worked, Grace became aware of her children's rapt attention. Maya and Lucas were watching every move she made, their faces reflecting a mixture of admiration and concern that made her chest tighten with emotion. She realized that this moment was about more than just helping an injured animal. It was about showing her children that compassion and kindness mattered, even when resources were limited. "There," she said softly, sitting back on her heels to admire her handiwork. The white sock looked almost comical against the dog's brown fur, but it was clean and secure. That should help for now. The dog looked down at its bandaged paw, then back up at Grace, with what she could have sworn was gratitude. Lucas reached out tentatively to pet the dog's head, and Grace held her breath, ready to intervene if necessary. But the animal simply leaned into the boy's touch, its tail wagging more enthusiastically now. "It likes me," Lucas said with wonder, his face lighting up with joy. "It likes all of us," Maya added, kneeling down to join her brother in petting their new friend. "What should we call it?" Grace hadn't considered that they might be gaining a pet. Her lease specifically prohibited animals, and she could barely afford to feed her family, let alone a dog. But looking at the way her children were bonding with the injured animal, she found it difficult to voice these practical concerns. "Let's see if it has an owner first," she said diplomatically. "It might belong to someone who's looking for it." The dog had no collar, and its matted fur suggested it had been on its own for some time. Grace made a mental note to check with the local animal shelter and post on social media to see if anyone was missing a pet, though something told her that this dog had been fending for itself for quite a while. "Can we at least give it some food?" Maya asked, her practical nature coming through. "It looks really skinny." Grace glanced at her watch and felt the familiar pressure of time constraints. She had to get home to start dinner with the hint ingredients she had, and she needed to review her work schedule for the next day. Her job at the diner required her to be on her feet for 8 hours, and she couldn't afford to be late or miss shifts. But looking at the hopeful faces of her children and the trusting eyes of the dog, she felt her resolve weakening. "We can share some of our dinner," she said finally, knowing that it would mean smaller portions for all of them, but unable to deny the animal's obvious need. "But first, let's get home and see how our friend does with that bandage." As they gathered their things to leave, Grace was surprised when the dog struggled to its feet and began to follow them. It walked slowly, favoring its injured paw, but it was determined to keep up. The makeshift bandage seemed to be providing some relief, and the animal's spirits appeared to be improving with each step. "I think it wants to come home with us," Lucas observed with the straightforward logic of childhood. "Animals sometimes follow people who help them," Grace explained, though she was touched by the dog's apparent attachment to their family. "But we need to be responsible about this. If it doesn't belong to anyone, we'll have to figure out what's best for everyone." The walk home took longer than usual, as they adjusted their pace to accommodate their four-legged companion. Grace found herself watching the dog's gait, pleased to see that the bandage was staying in place and seemed to be providing some comfort. The animal's coat, though matted and dirty, showed signs of having been well cared for at some point, suggesting it had been someone's pet before finding itself alone on the streets. Their apartment building was a modest 2-story structure on the outskirts of town, with paint peeling from the sides and a front yard that had seen better days. Grace had chosen it primarily for its affordability and proximity to the children's school, but it had become home over the past year. As they approached the building, she wondered what Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived in the unit below them, would think about their unexpected guest. "Mom, look," Maya said, pointing to the dog, who had stopped walking and was sniffing the air with interest. "It's like it knows where we live." Grace watched as the animal seemed to take in its surroundings, its amber eyes alert and curious. There was something almost regal about the way it carried itself, despite its obvious injuries and current circumstances. She had the strangest feeling that this dog was more than just a stray, that there was a story behind those intelligent eyes that she might never fully understand. Inside their small apartment, Grace was faced with the practical challenges of caring for an unexpected guest. The dog needed water, food, and a place to rest, but she also needed to maintain boundaries. She spread an old towel on the floor near the kitchen and filled a bowl with water, which the animal eagerly accepted. "What are we going to feed it?" Maya asked, looking through their modest pantry with the critical eye of someone already invested in their guests' welfare. Grace surveyed their dinner options: a package of pasta, some canned tomatoes, and a small amount of ground beef she had been planning to stretch into a meal for 3. "We'll make it work," she said, though she was already mentally calculating how to make the food go further. "Dogs can eat some of the same things we do." As she prepared their meal, Grace found herself stealing glances at the dog, who had settled on the towel and was resting its head on its paws. The animal's presence somehow made their small apartment feel warmer, more complete. Maya and Lucas had positioned themselves on the floor nearby, taking turns gently petting their new friend and talking to it in soft, soothing voices. "I think it's feeling better," Lucas announced, his young voice filled with pride. "See how it's not whimpering anymore?" It was true. The dog's demeanor had changed significantly since they had bandaged its paw. While it was still clearly tired and sore, there was a peacefulness about it that hadn't been there in the alley. Grace found herself wondering if the animal had been waiting for someone to show it kindness, if perhaps it had been searching for a family to care for it. Dinner was a quieter affair than usual, with everyone conscious of their guest's presence. Grace divided the pasta and meat sauce into 4 portions, giving the dog a smaller serving in a disposable bowl she had found in the back of the cabinet. The animal ate slowly but gratefully, its tail wagging slightly as it consumed what was probably its first proper meal in days. "It has good manners," Maya observed, watching the way the dog ate without making a mess or showing any food aggression. "Someone must have trained it well." Grace nodded, noting the same thing. This wasn't a feral animal or one that had been on the streets for its entire life. Someone had loved this dog once, had taught it how to behave around people and food. The thought made her heart ache, wondering what circumstances had led to the animal being alone and injured. After dinner, Grace faced the challenge of where the dog would sleep. Her lease agreement was clear about pets, but she couldn't bring herself to put the injured animal back on the streets. She decided to let it stay the night, figuring she would deal with the consequences in the morning. She made a bed using old blankets in the living room, far enough from the bedrooms to maintain some boundaries but close enough to keep an eye on their guest. As she tucked Maya and Lucas into bed, both children peppered her with questions about their new friend. "Will it be here when we wake up?" Lucas asked, his voice small and hopeful. "I don't know, sweetheart," Grace answered honestly. "Sometimes animals leave when they're feeling better. But if it's still here in the morning, we'll figure out what to do next." Maya, ever the practical one, had already begun planning. "We should make posters," she said seriously, "with pictures of the dog and our phone number. That's what people do when they find lost pets." Grace smiled at her daughter's thoughtfulness. "That's a very good idea. We'll work on that tomorrow if our friend is still here." But as she settled into her own bed, Grace found herself hoping that the dog would still be there in the morning. Despite the practical challenges it presented, the animal had brought something special into their home, a sense of purpose and connection that had been missing since the divorce. Her children had shown remarkable compassion and maturity, and she was proud of the way they had risen to the occasion. The next morning, Grace woke to the sound of excited whispers from the living room. She padded out in her robe to find Maya and Lucas sitting on the floor next to the dog, who was awake and alert. The makeshift bandage was still in place, and the animal's eyes were brighter than they had been the evening before. "It's still here, Mom," Maya announced unnecessarily, her face glowing with happiness. Grace knelt down to examine the dog's paw, pleased to see that the swelling had gone down slightly and there were no signs of increased infection. "How are you feeling this morning?" she asked the animal, who responded by thumping its tail against the floor. "Can we keep it?" Lucas asked, the question that Grace had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "We can't make that decision yet," Grace said gently, though her heart was already leaning toward finding a way to make it work. "We need to make sure it doesn't belong to someone else first, and we need to think about what's best for everyone, including the dog." After breakfast, Grace called in sick to work, something she rarely did but felt was necessary given the circumstances. She spent the morning creating simple flyers with Maya's help, describing the dog and providing her phone number. They walked around the neighborhood, posting the flyers on telephone poles and in shop windows, asking if anyone had lost a pet matching their description. The dog accompanied them on their walk, moving more easily now that it had rested and the bandage was providing support. Grace was amazed by how well-behaved the animal was, walking calmly beside them without a leash and showing no signs of aggression toward other dogs or people they encountered. "Maybe no one will call," Lucas said hopefully as they returned home. "And maybe someone will," Grace replied, though she found herself hoping for the same outcome as her son. "Either way, we've done the right thing by trying to find its owner." The afternoon passed quietly, with the dog content to rest while the children worked on homework. Grace found herself checking her phone repeatedly, part of her hoping it would ring and part of her hoping it wouldn't. The animal had settled into their routine so naturally that it felt like it had always been part of their family. As evening approached, Grace realized she would need to make a decision about work the next day. She couldn't afford to miss another shift, but she also couldn't leave the injured dog alone all day. She was contemplating her options when she heard a sharp barking from the living room. Mom, come quick, Maya called, her voice filled with excitement and confusion. Something's wrong with the dog. Grace rushed to the living room to find the dog standing by the front door, barking insistently. Its posture was alert and urgent, completely different from the calm demeanor it had shown all day. The animal looked at her, then at the door, then back at her, as if trying to communicate something important. "What's the matter?" Grace asked, approaching the dog cautiously. The animal's behavior was so markedly different from what she had observed that she wondered if it was in pain or distress. The dog moved to the door and pawed at it, continuing to bark. Its message was clear. It wanted to go outside, and it wanted them to come with it. "Maybe it needs to go to the bathroom," Lucas suggested practically. But Grace sensed this was something more urgent. The dog's behavior had an almost frantic quality to it, as if it was trying to tell them something important. "Let's see what it wants," she said, reaching for the leash she had borrowed from a neighbor. As soon as she opened the door, the dog started down the stairs, looking back to make sure they were following. Its limp was still noticeable, but it moved with purpose and determination. Grace found herself curious about where the animal was leading them, though she made sure to keep Maya and Lucas close beside her. The dog led them away from their apartment building, down streets Grace recognized, and then onto paths she had never explored. The October sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape as they walked deeper into the wooded area on the outskirts of town. Grace began to feel a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she realized they were venturing into unfamiliar territory. "Mom, where are we going?" Maya asked, her voice reflecting the same uncertainty Grace was feeling. "I'm not sure," Grace admitted, keeping her eyes on the dog, who continued to move forward with unwavering determination. "But our friend seems to know exactly where it wants to take us." The path they were following was overgrown and obviously rarely used. Branches caught at their clothes and leaves crunched under their feet as they made their way deeper into the woods. Grace found herself questioning the wisdom of following an animal into such an isolated area, but something about the dog's behavior convinced her that this journey was important. After about 20 minutes of walking, the dog suddenly stopped and began barking again, this time even more urgently than before. Grace looked around, trying to see what had captured the animal's attention. Through the trees, she could make out the outline of a small structure, barely visible in the fading light. "What is that?" Lucas asked, pointing toward the building. Grace squinted in the dim light, making out what appeared to be a small cabin, clearly abandoned and partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. The structure looked like it hadn't been occupied for years, with boards missing from the sides and vines growing up the walls. The dog was staring at the cabin intently, its whole body tense with anticipation. "It's an old cabin," Grace said, her curiosity now fully aroused. "I wonder how long it's been empty." The dog looked at her expectantly, then trotted toward the cabin, still favoring its injured paw but moving with obvious purpose. Grace felt a mixture of excitement and caution as she followed, her children close behind her. The whole situation felt surreal, like something out of an adventure story rather than her ordinary life. The cabin was small, probably no more than one room, with a covered porch that had partially collapsed. The door was slightly ajar, hanging on rusted hinges that creaked ominously in the evening breeze. Grace could see that the windows were broken, and the roof had several holes that had let in weather and debris over the years. "Should we go in? Should we go inside?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace hesitated, weighing the potential dangers against her growing curiosity about why the dog had brought them here. The animal was now sitting by the door, looking at them with that same intelligent expression she had noticed in the alley. There was something about its demeanor that suggested this wasn't just a random destination. that there was a specific reason they had been led to this place. "Let's be very careful," Grace said finally, pulling out her phone to use its flashlight. "Stay close to me, and if I say we're leaving, we leave immediately." The door opened with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo through the abandoned structure. Grace's phone light revealed a small room filled with debris, fallen leaves, and the detritus of years of neglect. The floorboards were warped and stained, and she could see daylight through gaps in the roof. But the dog was already inside, moving toward the far corner of the room with renewed urgency. "Be careful where you step," Grace warned her children as they entered the cabin. The floorboards felt solid enough, but she could see areas where the wood had rotted or been damaged by water. The dog had stopped by what appeared to be an old fireplace, its stones blackened with age and partially collapsed. But instead of investigating the fireplace itself, the animal was pawing in a section of the floor nearby, whimpering softly as it tried to dig through the debris. "What's it doing?" Lucas asked, fascinated by the dog's behavior. Grace approached cautiously, shining her phone light on the area where the dog was focused. As she swept away leaves and dirt, she could see that the floorboards in this section were different from the rest of the room. They appeared to be newer, or at least had been replaced at some point, and they didn't fit together as tightly as the original flooring. "I think there might be something under here," Grace said, her heart beginning to race with anticipation. The whole situation felt like something out of a treasure hunting story, but the dog's insistent behavior suggested that there was indeed something significant about this spot. Maya knelt down beside her mother, using her hands to help clear away the debris. "Mom, look at this," she said, pointing to what appeared to be a small gap between two boards. "There's definitely something underneath." Grace examined the area more closely, her excitement growing as she realized that the boards could probably be lifted with some effort. The dog was watching her intently, its tail wagging slightly as if it approved of her investigation. Taking a deep breath, Grace worked her fingers into the gap and pulled upward. The board came up easily, revealing a dark space underneath. Grace's phone light illuminated what appeared to be a small cavity that had been deliberately created beneath the floor. And there, sitting in the hollow space, was a metal box about the size of a large shoebox. "Oh my God," Grace whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for the container. The box was heavier than she expected, and she could hear things shifting inside as she lifted it from its hiding place. The metal was old but not rusted, suggesting it had been well protected from the elements. "What's in it?" Maya asked, her voice filled with wonder and excitement. Grace set the box on a relatively clean section of the floor and examined it carefully. There was no lock, just a simple latch that had been designed to keep the contents secure. Her heart was pounding as she realized that they might be about to discover something that had been hidden for years, possibly decades. "Let's find out," she said, working the latch open with fingers that were shaking with anticipation. The box opened with a soft click, and Grace's phone light revealed contents that made her gasp aloud. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth to protect them from moisture, were items that clearly had significant value. She could see jewelry, what looked like old coins, and several official-looking documents. "Mom, what is all this stuff?" Lucas asked, his eyes wide with amazement. Grace carefully lifted the oilcloth, revealing the contents more clearly. There were several pieces of jewelry, including what appeared to be a gold watch and some elaborate brooches that looked like they might be antiques. But it was the documents that caught her attention. They appeared to be military bonds, official certificates with government seals and formal language that suggested they had monetary value. At the bottom of the box, Grace found a handwritten note on aged paper. She lifted it carefully, her hand still trembling as she read the words aloud in the dim light of her phone. "To whoever finds this, Use it for good. The war took everything from me except these few things. I hope we can help someone who needs them more than I do. Jonathan Wesley, 1953. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind through the trees outside the cabin. Grace stared at the note, trying to process what they had discovered. Someone had hidden these valuables more than 70 years ago, and they had remained undisturbed until this moment. Does this mean we're rich? Maya asked, her practical nature asserting itself even in the face of such an extraordinary discovery. I don't know, Grace said honestly, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. We need to find out if these things are still valuable, and we need to make sure we're doing the right thing legally. The dog, who had been quietly watching their discovery, suddenly approached Grace and gently nudged her hand with its nose. It was as if the animal was acknowledging that its job was done, that it had successfully led them to what they were meant to find. You knew, didn't you? Grace said softly, looking into the dog's amber eyes. You knew this was here. The walk back to their apartment felt like a dream. Grace carried the metal box carefully, her mind spinning with questions and possibilities. How had the dog known about the hidden treasure? Had it been there before, or did it have some other connection to the cabin? And most importantly, what did this discovery mean for their future? Back at home, Grace spread the contents of the box on her kitchen table, while Maya and Lucas watched with fascination. In the better light of her apartment, she could see that the jewelry was indeed valuable, with hallmarks that suggested quality craftsmanship. The military bonds were more mysterious, but they appeared to be legitimate government documents from the 1940s and 1950s. We need to get these appraised, Grace said, though she was already beginning to suspect that they represented a significant sum of money. And we need to research whether Jonathan Wesley had any living relatives who might have a claim to these items. Maya picked up one of the brooches, admiring its intricate design. But he said to use it for good, she pointed out. That means he wanted someone like us to find it. Grace nodded, reading the note again. There was something about the simple, honest language of Jonathan Wesley's message that moved her deeply. This man, who had apparently lost everything in the war, had hidden his remaining valuables with the hope that they would eventually help someone in need. The fact that a stray dog had led them to this treasure felt like more than coincidence. Over the next few days, Grace threw herself into researching their discovery. She took time off work, something she could barely afford but felt was necessary given the circumstances. She visited the local library, searched online records, and even contacted a military historian to learn more about the bonds they had found. The news was better than she had dared to hope. The military bonds, which had been issued during World War II, had continued to accrue interest over the decades and were now worth considerably more than their original value. The jewelry, when appraised by a professional, proved to be valuable antique pieces. Altogether, their discovery was worth enough money to change their lives completely. But Grace's research also revealed that Jonathan Wesley had died in 1954, just a year after hiding his treasure. He had been a veteran who had lost his family in the war and had lived alone in the cabin until his death. He had no known relatives, and the property had eventually been abandoned when the county was unable to locate any heirs. So it's really ours? Maya asked when Grace explained what she had learned. It appears so, Grace said, still hardly believing their good fortune. But I want to make sure we handle this properly. We need to report the find to the authorities and make sure all the legal requirements are met. The process of claiming their treasure was more complex than Grace had expected, involving lawyers, government officials, and extensive paperwork. But eventually, everything was settled legally, and they were free to decide how to use their unexpected windfall. The dog, who had been officially adopted by their family during this process, seemed to understand that its mission was complete. Grace had taken it to a veterinarian who had treated its injured paw properly and pronounced it healthy. The animal, which they had named Scout in honor of its role in their discovery, had settled into their family as if it had always belonged there. "So what do we do now?" Lucas asked one evening as they sat around their kitchen table. The legal documents that confirmed their ownership of the treasure spread out before them. Grace had been thinking about this question for weeks. The money was enough to pay off her debts, buy a house, and provide security for her children's future. But she couldn't stop thinking about Jonathan Wesley's note and his instruction to use the treasure for good. "I have an idea," she said slowly, looking at her children and then at Scout, who was lying contentedly at their feet. "What if we use this money to help other animals like Scout?" Maya's eyes lit up with understanding. "You mean like an animal shelter? Or a rescue organization?" Grace said, her excitement growing as she spoke. "We could help stray animals find homes, provide medical care for injured pets, and maybe even train them to be therapy animals for people who need them." Lucas clapped his hands together. "And Scout could be our first official rescue dog." Grace smiled, feeling a sense of rightness about this decision that she hadn't experienced in months. "I think Jonathan Wesley would approve," she said, glancing at the handwritten note that had started this whole journey. He wanted his treasure to help people, and what better way than by caring for the animals that bring so much joy to our lives? The process of establishing their animal rescue organization took several months. But Grace found herself energized by the work in a way she hadn't felt since before her divorce. She rented a small building on the outskirts of town, hired a part-time veterinarian, and began taking in animals that needed care and rehabilitation. Scout proved to be an invaluable addition to their operation. The dog had an uncanny ability to calm frightened animals and seemed to understand which humans needed extra attention. Grace often found herself wondering if Scout's special abilities were part of what had led them to the treasure in the first place. Second Chance Animal Rescue, as they named their organization, quickly became known throughout the community for its compassionate care and successful adoption programs. Grace was able to quit her job at the diner and focus full-time on the rescue work, while Maya and Lucas helped with daily operations and learned valuable lessons about responsibility and compassion. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story was how it brought their family closer together. The shared experience of caring for animals in need gave them a common purpose that strengthened their bond and helped them heal from the difficulties of the past few years. One evening, as Grace was locking up the rescue facility after a particularly busy day, she found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led them to this point. If they hadn't heard that dog whimpering in the alley, if they hadn't stopped to help, if they hadn't followed Scout to the abandoned cabin, their lives would have been completely different. Maya, now 9 years old and already an accomplished animal caretaker, joined her mother in the office. "Mom, do you ever wonder if Scout knew all along what was going to happen?" Grace looked out the window at the play area where Scout was supervising a group of rescue dogs, his bandaged paw long since healed, but his protective instincts as strong as ever. "I think some things are meant to be," she said quietly. "Sometimes the most broken things lead us to the greatest treasures." As if sensing their conversation, Scout looked up and caught Grace's eye through the window. His amber eyes held the same intelligence and understanding that had first captured her attention in that alley so many months ago. He wagged his tail once, then returned his attention to the other dogs, content in his role as protector and guide. Grace smiled, putting her arm around her daughter's shoulders. They had started this journey as a struggling family trying to help one injured animal. They had ended up with a new purpose, financial security, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to make a difference in the world. The treasure they had found in that abandoned cabin had been valuable, but the real treasure was the realization that sometimes the most important discoveries come from the simple act of stopping to help someone in need. Scout had led them to hidden gold, but more importantly, he had led them to a new way of living that honored both Jonathan Wesley's wishes and their own capacity for compassion. As they turned off the lights and prepared to head home, Grace felt grateful for every step that had brought them to this moment. The scared, injured dog they had helped with nothing but a wool sock and medical tape had given them far more than they had given him. He had shown them that even in the darkest times, hope and help could come from the most unexpected places. Walking home through the quiet streets, with Scout trotting contentedly beside them and her children chattering about their plans for the rescue, Grace realized that their story was far from over. There were more animals to help, more families to serve, and more adventures to be had. The months that followed brought a steady stream of animals through their doors. There was Bella, a three-legged cat who had been hit by a car and needed weeks of rehabilitation before finding her forever home with an elderly man who appreciated her gentle nature. Then came Max, a German Shepherd mix who had been abandoned by his previous owners and struggled with anxiety until Scout took him under his wing, teaching him to trust humans again through patient example. Each rescue brought its own challenges and rewards, but Grace found that Scout seemed to have an intuitive understanding of what each animal needed. He would lie quietly beside frightened cats until they felt safe enough to explore their surroundings. He would play gently with puppies who needed to learn social skills, and he would provide calm companionship for older dogs who were grieving the loss of their previous families. The community response to Second Chance Animal Rescue exceeded Grace's wildest expectations. Donations poured in from people who had heard their story, volunteers offered their time and expertise, and local veterinarians provided discounted services. The local newspaper ran a feature story about their unusual beginning, and soon people were coming from neighboring towns to adopt animals and support their mission. Maya had developed a particular talent for matching animals with the right families. She would spend hours talking with potential adopters, asking questions about their lifestyle and preferences, then somehow knowing exactly which animal would be the perfect fit. Her success rate was remarkable, and Grace often marveled at her daughter's intuitive understanding of both human and animal nature. Lucas had gravitated toward the more hands-on aspects of animal care. He helped with feeding, cleaning, and basic medical care, always under supervision but showing a natural aptitude for the work. His gentle touch and patient demeanor made him particularly effective with animals who had been traumatized or abused. One afternoon in late spring, nearly a year after their discovery of the treasure, Grace was working in her office when she heard excited voices from the main kennel area. She looked up to see Maya leading a young couple toward the section where they kept the longer-term residents, animals who had been with them for months while waiting for the right home. "This is Charlie," Maya was saying, stopping in front of a kennel that housed a middle-aged golden retriever who had been surrendered by his family when they moved to an apartment that didn't allow pets. "He's been with us for 4 months, and he's the sweetest dog you'll ever meet. He loves children, he's house-trained, and he knows all the basic commands." Grace watched as the couple knelt down to interact with Charlie, who immediately pressed against the kennel door, his tail wagging enthusiastically. There was something about the way the three of them connected that told Grace this would be another successful match. Scout appeared at her side, as he often did when potential adoptions were taking place. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense when important decisions were being made, and he seemed to take a personal interest in ensuring that every animal found the right home. "What do you think?" Grace asked quietly, scratching behind Scout's ears. "Is Charlie going to be happy with them?" Scout's tail wagged once, and he settled down beside her chair, content to observe the proceedings. Over the months, Grace had learned to trust Scout's instincts about people and situations. The dog had never been wrong about potential adopters, and his calm demeanor during this interaction suggested that Charlie was indeed going home with the right family. Later that evening, after Charlie had left with his new family and the daily operations were winding down, Grace found herself reflecting on how much their lives had changed. The financial security provided by Jonathan Wesley's treasure had allowed them to create something meaningful and lasting, but the real transformation had been in their sense of purpose and connection to their community. She thought about the note they had found in that metal box, with its simple instruction to use the treasure for good. Jonathan Wesley, a man who had lost everything in war, had somehow managed to provide exactly what her family had needed, not just to survive, but to thrive and help others in the process. The rescue now employed 3 full-time staff members in addition to Grace, and they had expanded their services to include educational programs for local schools and therapy animal training for hospitals and nursing homes. Scout had become something of a local celebrity, not just for his role in their origin story, but for his work as a therapy dog visiting patients who needed comfort and companionship. Maya, now 10 years old, had started a blog about animal rescue that was gaining followers from around the country. She wrote about their daily experiences, shared photos of successful adoptions, and provided tips for people interested in animal rescue work. Her writing showed a maturity and compassion that made Grace proud, and several of her posts had been shared widely on social media. Lucas, approaching his 8th birthday, had convinced Grace to let him start a small vegetable garden behind the rescue building. He had read that fresh vegetables could be beneficial for some animals, and he wanted to contribute to their care in his own way. The garden had become a peaceful space where both animals and humans could relax, and Lucas took enormous pride in harvesting produce that helped keep their residents healthy. But perhaps the most significant development had been the relationships they had built with other rescue organizations and animal welfare groups. Grace had been invited to speak at conferences about their unique approach to animal rescue, and Second Chance had become a model for other communities looking to establish similar programs. During one of these speaking engagements, Grace had met Dr. Sarah Martinez, a veterinary behaviorist who was doing research on the emotional intelligence of rescue animals. Dr. Martinez had been particularly interested in Scout's story and had asked to observe him working with other animals at the rescue. "I've never seen anything quite like it," Dr. Martinez had told Grace after spending a week documenting Scout's interactions. "He seems to have an intuitive understanding of what each animal needs, and his presence has a measurably calming effect on stressed or traumatized animals. It's quite remarkable." Grace had always known Scout was special, but hearing it confirmed by a professional had reinforced her belief that their meeting with the injured dog had been more than just coincidence. There was something almost mystical about the way Scout had entered their lives and guided them toward their destiny. As autumn approached, marking nearly 18 months since their first encounter with Scout, Grace decided to organize a celebration to mark the anniversary of Second Chance Animal Rescue. The event would be both a fundraiser and a reunion, bringing together families who had adopted animals and community members who had supported their mission. The planning process gave Maya and Lucas an opportunity to contribute their own ideas and take on age-appropriate responsibilities. Maya designed flyers and managed the social media promotion, while Lucas worked with local businesses to secure donations for a silent auction. Scout seemed to sense the excitement building and could often be found supervising the preparations with his characteristic calm authority. The celebration took place on a perfect October afternoon, with golden sunshine filtering through the trees around their facility. Families arrived with their adopted pets, many of whom had transformed from frightened, injured animals into beloved family members. Grace found herself surrounded by success stories, each one a testament to the power of second chances and the healing bond between humans and animals. Charlie, the golden retriever who had been adopted the previous spring, arrived with his new family, his coat gleaming and his demeanor radiating contentment. He had gained weight, his eyes were bright and alert, and he moved with the confidence of a dog who knew he was loved and secure. "He's been such a blessing to our family," his adoptive mother told Grace, tears in her eyes. "I can't imagine our lives without him now. Thank you for taking such good care of him until we found each other." Similar conversations took place throughout the afternoon, each one reinforcing Grace's conviction that they had found their true calling. But it was the quiet moments that touched her most deeply, like watching Scout gently interact with a shy child who was afraid of dogs, or seeing Lucas patiently explain animal care techniques to other children. "Who are interested in rescue work?" As the day was winding down and families were beginning to say their goodbyes, Grace found herself standing in the same spot where she had first established the rescue. The building had been expanded twice to accommodate their growing operations, and the grounds now included play areas, training facilities, and the vegetable garden that had become Lucas's pride and joy. Maya approached her, holding a scrapbook she'd been working on for weeks. "I made this for you," she said, presenting the book with the same solemnity she had shown when helping with Scout's injured paw all those months ago. Grace opened the scrapbook to find page after page of photographs, documents, and memorabilia from their journey. There were pictures of Scout on that first day, still wearing his makeshift sock bandage. There were photos of the abandoned cabin and the metal box that had held their treasure. Most importantly, there were dozens of before and after pictures of animals they had helped, each one accompanied by the story of their rescue and adoption. "This is beautiful," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion as she turned the pages. "You've captured everything that matters about what we're doing here." The final page of a scrapbook contained a new photograph that Maya had taken just that morning. It showed Scout lying in a patch of sunlight in the main kennel area, surrounded by several of their current residents. The image perfectly captured the peaceful atmosphere that Scout brought to their facility, and his natural role as protector and guide for animals in need. Below the photograph, Maya had written a caption in her careful handwriting. "Scout teaches us that sometimes the best treasures are the ones we find when we stop to help someone else." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes as she read her daughter's words. The simple wisdom of the statement captured everything she had learned over the past year and a half. They had thought they were just helping an injured dog, but Scout had led them to so much more than hidden gold. He had led them to a new understanding of purpose, community, and the profound satisfaction that comes from dedicating your life to helping others. As the last of their guests departed and the staff finished cleaning up from the celebration, Grace found herself alone with Scout in the quiet facility. The dog approached her and sat down beside her chair, looking up at her with those same intelligent amber eyes that had first captured her attention in the alley. "You knew, didn't you?" she said softly, reaching down to stroke his head. "You knew exactly what we needed, and you knew how to help us find it." Scout's tail wagged gently, and he leaned against her leg in the way he did when he was content and relaxed. In that moment, Grace felt a deep sense of gratitude not just for the financial security they had gained, but for the journey that had brought them to this point. The treasure they had found in Jonathan Wesley's hiding place had provided the means to build their rescue operation, but the real treasure was the realization that their lives had meaning and purpose when they were dedicated to helping others. Scout had been the catalyst for this transformation, appearing in their lives at exactly the moment when they needed guidance and hope. As she locked up the facility and prepared to head home with Scout and her children, Grace reflected on how much they had all grown over the past months. Maya had developed confidence and leadership skills through her work with potential adopters and her blog writing. Lucas had discovered a passion for gardening and animal care that gave him a sense of accomplishment and purpose. And Grace herself had found a career that fulfilled her in ways she had never experienced before. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned that the greatest treasures in life often come disguised as problems that need solving or creatures that need help. Scout had taught them that compassion and kindness, offered without expectation of reward, could lead to discoveries that were far more valuable than gold or precious stones. Walking home through the familiar streets, Grace noticed details that had escaped her attention during those difficult months after her divorce. The changing colors of the autumn leaves, the sound of children playing in nearby yards, the warm glow of lights in windows as families gathered for dinner. She realized that her ability to appreciate these simple pleasures had been restored, along with her sense of security and purpose. That night, as she tucked Maya and Lucas into bed, both children were full of plans and ideas for the future of their rescue operation. Maya wanted to start a program that would bring therapy animals to children's hospitals, while Lucas was designing an expanded garden that could provide healthy food for more animals. "Mom," Maya said, as Grace was turning off her bedroom light, "do you think we'll ever find another treasure like the one Scout showed us?" Grace paused in the doorway, considering her daughter's question. "I think we find treasures every day," she said finally. "Every time we help an animal find a loving home, every time we see a scared dog learn to trust again, every time we make a difference in someone's life. Those are all treasures, just different kinds." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "I guess Scout taught us how to recognize them." "Yes," Grace agreed. "I think he did." Later that evening, after both children were asleep and the house was quiet, Grace sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked through Maya's scrapbook again. Each page told part of their story, but she realized that the story was far from over. They had established something that would continue to grow and evolve, helping animals and families for years to come. Scout lay at her feet, his breathing slow and regular in the peaceful rhythm of deep sleep. Every now and then, his legs would move slightly, as if he were dreaming of running through fields or playing with other dogs. Grace hoped his dreams were happy ones, filled with the same contentment and purpose that had characterized his waking hours since joining their family. As she prepared for bed, Grace thought about Jonathan Wesley and the note he had left with his hidden treasure. She wondered if he could have imagined that his simple instruction to use it for good would lead to the creation of an organization that had already helped hundreds of animals and families. His act of faith in leaving those valuables for someone else to find had created ripples of positive change that continued to spread through their community. The next morning brought the familiar routine of caring for their rescued animals, but Grace approached each task with renewed energy and enthusiasm. The celebration had reminded her of how far they had come and reinforced her commitment to their mission. She found herself looking forward to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Scout, as always, seemed to sense the mood of the day and moved through the facility with his characteristic calm authority. He visited each kennel, offering comfort to animals who were still adjusting to their new surroundings and providing companionship to those who had been with them longer. His presence had become such an integral part of their operations that Grace couldn't imagine running the rescue without him. As the weeks passed and autumn gave way to winter, Second Chance Animal Rescue continued to thrive. They had achieved a placement rate that exceeded national averages, and their innovative programs were being studied by animal welfare organizations across the country. Grace had been invited to write articles for professional journals and speak at national conferences about their approach to rescue work. But success brought new challenges and responsibilities. The demand for their services was growing faster than their capacity, and Grace found herself constantly balancing the desire to help more animals with the need to maintain the quality of care that had become their trademark. It was a good problem to have, but it required careful planning and decision-making. During one particularly busy week in December, when they were caring for more animals than ever before and processing applications from families wanting to adopt pets as Christmas gifts, Grace found herself feeling overwhelmed by the scope of their operations. She was working late one evening, trying to organize schedules and coordinate with volunteer groups, when Scout appeared at her office door. The dog approached her desk and rested his chin on her arm, looking up at her with those expressive amber eyes that had become so familiar. It was the same gentle gesture he used to comfort frightened animals, and Grace realized that he was offering her the same kind of support he provided to the creatures in their care. "You always know when someone needs you, don't you?" she said softly, taking a break from her paperwork to give Scout the attention he deserved. "Even when that someone is me." Scout's tail wagged gently, and he settled down beside her chair, content to provide quiet companionship while she finished her work. His presence reminded Grace that the most important aspects of their mission weren't captured in spreadsheets or administrative documents. What mattered was the daily acts of compassion and care that transformed the lives of animals and families. As Christmas approached, Grace decided to establish a new tradition for their rescue family. They would gather on Christmas Eve to celebrate not just the holiday, but the bonds they had formed through their shared commitment to animal welfare. It would be a time to reflect on their accomplishments and look forward to the challenges and opportunities of the coming year. The celebration took place in the main kennel area, which had been decorated with lights and garlands donated by local businesses. Staff members and volunteers brought dishes to share, creating a potluck feast that reflected the diverse backgrounds and traditions of their rescue community. The animals seemed to sense the festive atmosphere and were more relaxed and playful than usual. Maya and Lucas had prepared a presentation about their goals for the coming year, including plans for expanded educational programs and new partnerships with other animal welfare organizations. Their enthusiasm and commitment impressed everyone present and reinforced Grace's pride in how much her children had grown through their involvement in rescue work. But the highlight of the evening came when Scout, seemingly without any prompting, walked to the center of the gathering and sat down, looking around at all the people and animals who had become his extended family. It was as if he was acknowledging the community that had grown around their shared mission and expressing his own satisfaction with what they had accomplished together. "I think Scout approves," Grace said, her voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "And I think Jonathan Wesley would approve too. We've used his treasure to create something that continues to grow and help others, just as he hoped." As the evening wound down and people began to say their goodbyes, Grace felt a deep sense of satisfaction and anticipation. They had built something meaningful and lasting, but she knew that their best work was still ahead of them. There were more animals to help, more families to serve, and more innovations to develop in their approach to rescue work. Walking home with Scout and her children through the quiet streets of their town, Grace marveled at how much their lives had changed since that October afternoon when they had first heard a dog whimpering in an alley. They had started with nothing but compassion and a makeshift bandage made from a wool sock, and they had built a thriving organization that was making a real difference in their community. The treasure they had found had provided the financial foundation for their work, but the real treasure was the realization that their lives had purpose and meaning when they were dedicated to helping others. Scout had been their guide on this journey, leading them not just to hidden gold, but to a deeper understanding of what it meant to live a life of service and compassion. As they reached their front door, Grace looked back at the route they had taken, thinking about all the animals and families they had helped along the way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new animals in need of care, and new families looking for the perfect pet to complete their homes. But tonight, she was content to reflect on how far they had come, and to appreciate the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Scout had taught them that the greatest treasures are often found not in grand adventures, but in the simple act of stopping to help someone in need. It was a lesson that continued to guide their work and enrich their lives, one rescued animal at a time. 3 years later, Grace stood before a packed auditorium at the National Animal Welfare Conference, her presentation slides displaying photographs from Second Chance Animal Rescue's latest expansion. The facility now encompassed 15 acres and included specialized rehabilitation centers for wildlife, a veterinary clinic that served the broader community, and training facilities for service dogs. Scout, now officially certified as a therapy dog supervisor, sat calmly beside the podium, his graying muzzle a testament to the wisdom he had gained through years of service. "The most remarkable aspect of our journey," Grace told the audience of animal welfare professionals, "has been discovering that innovation often comes from necessity, and necessity often comes from simply paying attention to what's right in front of us." She clicked to a slide showing their latest project, a mobile veterinary unit that brought free medical care to underserved rural communities. The mobile clinic had been Maya's idea, now 13 and already accepted into a summer program for aspiring veterinarians. She had noticed that many of the animals brought to the rescue came from areas where veterinary care was either unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Her proposal for the mobile unit had been so well researched and compelling that the county had provided matching funds for the project. Lucas, now 11, and officially the rescue's head gardener, had transformed their modest vegetable patch into a working farm that supplied fresh produce not only for the animals but for a food bank that distributed meals to low-income families. His greenhouse operation had become so successful that agricultural students from the local community college regularly visited to study his innovative growing techniques. The success of Second Chance had attracted attention from universities studying the intersection of animal welfare and community development. Dr. Martinez had published several papers based on her ongoing research at their facility, with Scout featuring prominently in studies about the therapeutic benefits of animal companionship. The dog's ability to assess and respond to the emotional needs of both animals and humans had proven to be scientifically measurable and professionally valuable. During the question and answer session following her presentation, a woman from Montana asked Grace about the challenges of maintaining quality care while expanding operations. "The temptation is always to grow faster than your capacity," Grace replied, glancing down at Scout, who seemed to be listening intently to the conversation. "But we've learned to let our mission guide our growth rather than letting growth drive our mission." She explained how they had developed a careful vetting process for new programs and partnerships, always asking whether proposed changes would enhance their ability to provide individualized care for animals in trial. Need. Scout had somehow become an unofficial consultant in these decisions, his presence at planning meetings serving as a reminder of the personal connections that made their work meaningful. After the conference, Grace and Scout flew back home to find the rescue buzzing with activity around a new arrival. A pregnant stray cat had been found in an abandoned warehouse, malnourished and clearly near delivery. The veterinary team was monitoring her closely, preparing for what could be a complicated birth given her weakened condition. Maya met them at the airport, her face showing the kind of focused concern that had become characteristic of her approach to animal care. "Dr. Rodriguez thinks she might deliver tonight," she reported, referring to their head veterinarian. "The ultrasound shows at least 4 kittens, maybe 5. She's stable for now, but we're keeping close watch." Scout immediately requested to visit the expectant mother, a behavior that the staff had learned to recognize as significant. Over the years, the dog had developed an uncanny ability to predict when animals were in distress or when complications might arise. His presence often seemed to have a calming effect that facilitated healing and recovery. The cat, whom they had named Hope, was resting in one of their specialized maternity suites when Scout approached her kennel. Instead of the usual wariness that pregnant strays often showed toward other animals, Hope seemed to relax when she saw Scout. The dog settled down outside her kennel, assuming the patient vigil that had become his signature approach to animals in crisis. "He knows," Maya observed, settling down beside Scout with a thermos of coffee and a stack of veterinary textbooks. At 13, she was already reading at a college level and had absorbed more practical knowledge about animal care than many adults in the field. "Remember when Charlie was having his surgery? Scout waited right here in this same position until he woke up." Grace nodded, remembering dozens of similar incidents over the years. Scout's intuitive understanding of animal behavior in medical situations had saved lives and prevented complications on numerous occasions. The veterinary staff now routinely consulted him, in their own informal way, when making decisions about treatment protocols and recovery strategies. As evening approached, Hope began showing signs of active labor. Dr. Rodriguez and her team prepared for the delivery while Scout maintained his position nearby, his calm presence providing reassurance not just to the cat but to the humans involved in her care. The entire facility seemed to hold its breath as they waited for new life to arrive. The first kitten was born just after midnight, a healthy tabby who immediately began nursing. The second and third followed within an hour, both strong and vocal. But complications arose with the fourth kitten, who appeared to be positioned incorrectly in the birth canal. Dr. Rodriguez worked carefully to assist with the delivery while Hope struggled with obvious exhaustion. Scout, who had remained motionless for hours, suddenly stood and approached the kennel door. His behavior was different from his usual calm observation, more urgent and purposeful. He made a soft whining sound, something he rarely did, and looked directly at Dr. Rodriguez with an intensity that caught everyone's attention. "What is it, Scout?" Dr. Rodriguez asked, pausing in her work to look at the dog. "What are you trying to tell us?" Scout pawed gently at the kennel door, then sat down and tilted his head in the distinctive way he did when he was trying to communicate something important. Maya, who had become expert at interpreting Scout's signals, suddenly straightened up with understanding. "I think he wants to go in with her," Maya said. "Remember how he helped that aggressive dog calm down last month? Maybe Hope needs his presence right now." Dr. Rodriguez considered this unconventional suggestion. In most circumstances, introducing another animal during a difficult birth would be inadvisable, but Scout's track record was undeniable. "Let's try it," she decided. "But slowly and carefully." They opened the kennel door just wide enough for Scout to enter, watching carefully for any signs of distress from Hope. Instead of becoming agitated, the cat seemed to welcome Scout's presence. The dog settled down beside her, close enough to provide comfort but positioned so as not to interfere with the medical procedures. Almost immediately, Hope's labor seemed to intensify in a more productive way. Within minutes, the fourth kitten was delivered safely, followed quickly by a fifth that no one had detected on the ultrasound. All 5 kittens were healthy and active, nursing vigorously while their mother rested peacefully beside Scout. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Rodriguez said softly, watching as Scout gently nuzzled Hope's head in what appeared to be congratulations. "It's like he knew exactly what she needed to feel safe enough to finish the delivery." Grace felt the familiar sense of awe that Scout's interventions always inspired. After all these years, she still didn't fully understand how the dog seemed to know exactly what each situation required, but she had learned to trust his instincts completely. His presence had become so integral to their operations that she couldn't imagine the rescue functioning without him. Over the following weeks, Scout appointed himself as guardian to Hope and her kittens. He would make regular visits to their kennel, checking on their progress and somehow conveying a sense of security that helped the cat family thrive. When potential adopters came to meet the kittens, Scout would position himself where he could observe the interactions, his approval or concern influencing the staff's decisions about placements. The story of Hope's rescue and delivery spread through their community, bringing new attention to the rescue's work and resulting in increased donations and volunteer applications. Local media covered the story, focusing particularly on Scout's role in facilitating the successful birth. The attention led to speaking invitations and consulting opportunities that further expanded their influence in the animal welfare community. But perhaps the most significant development was the decision by the university's veterinary school to establish a formal research partnership with Second Chance. Dr. Martinez would lead a comprehensive study of animal-assisted therapy and interspecies communication, with Scout serving as the primary research subject. The partnership would provide funding for expanded facilities and programs while contributing to scientific understanding of human-animal bonds. Maya threw herself into the research project with characteristic enthusiasm, designing experiments and collecting data on Scout's interactions with different animals. Her work was sophisticated enough to earn her early admission to the university's pre-veterinary program, making her one of the youngest students ever accepted into the prestigious program. Lucas had found his own path within the expanding organization, developing educational programs that brought school children to the rescue for hands-on learning about animal care and environmental stewardship. His natural teaching ability and deep knowledge of sustainable farming practices made him an effective educator, and his programs were being replicated at animal welfare organizations in other states. As Scout approached his 8th birthday, still healthy and active but showing signs of his advancing age, Grace began thinking about succession planning for the rescue. The organization had grown far beyond what any of them had imagined possible, and its influence continued to expand through partnerships and educational programs. One evening, as she was reviewing applications for their new training program for therapy dog handlers, Grace found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter with an injured stray dog to running a nationally recognized animal welfare organization, their story seemed almost too remarkable to be true. Scout, as if sensing her contemplative mood, approached her desk and rested his graying head on her arm. The gesture was familiar, one he had used countless times over the years to provide comfort and companionship. But tonight, Grace sensed something different in his demeanor, a kind of peaceful satisfaction that suggested he knew his mission was complete. "You've done so much good," she whispered, stroking his head gently. "More than we could ever have imagined when we first found you in that alley." Scout's tail wagged softly, and his amber eyes held the same intelligence and wisdom that had first captured her attention all those years ago. But now there was something else there, too, a sense of completion and contentment that spoke to the fulfillment of a purpose larger than any of them had understood at the beginning. The next morning brought news that would test everything they had built together. A natural disaster in a neighboring state had left hundreds of animals homeless and in need of emergency care. The state's emergency management agency was requesting assistance from experienced rescue organizations, and Second Chance had been specifically recommended based on their reputation for handling complex brass situations. Grace convened an emergency staff meeting to discuss the logistics of mounting a disaster response operation. They had the resources and expertise to help, but it would require mobilizing their entire team and temporarily suspending some of their regular operations. The decision would affect not only their staff and volunteers, but also the animals currently in their care. Scout attended the meeting, as he always did when important decisions were being made. As Grace outlined the scope of the disaster and the assistance being requested, the dog listened with the same focused attention he brought to all significant discussions. When she finished presenting the situation and opened the floor for questions and concerns, Scout stood up and walked to the center of the room. The gesture was unmistakable to everyone who had worked with Scout over the years. He was giving his approval for the mission, expressing his confidence in their ability to expand their compassion to help animals and families they had never met. His endorsement carried weight with the entire team, many of whom had learned to rely on his judgment in difficult situations. "If Scout thinks we can do it, then we can do it," Maya said, speaking for many in the room. "We've never turned away from animals who needed help, and we're not going to start now." The deployment to the disaster zone was the most challenging operation Second Chance had ever undertaken. They sent a team of 12 people, including Grace, Maya, Dr. Rodriguez, and Scout, along with 2 mobile veterinary units and enough supplies to establish a temporary animal shelter. The logistics were complex, but their years of experience managing multiple programs simultaneously had prepared them for this kind of coordinated response. The disaster area was heartbreaking, with entire communities destroyed and families separated from their pets in the chaos of evacuation. The temporary animal shelter they established became a beacon of hope for people desperately searching for missing pets and for animals who had been found injured and alone. Scout's role in the operation exceeded everyone's expectations. His ability to calm traumatized animals proved invaluable in the high-stress environment of the disaster zone. Equally important was his effect on the people they served, many of whom found comfort in his gentle presence during the most difficult period of their lives. One particularly moving moment came when Scout helped reunite an elderly man with his missing cat. The man had been searching the shelter daily for a week, growing more despondent with each visit. Scout had been working with a particularly frightened cat who refused to interact with humans, but when the elderly man entered the kennel area, Scout immediately led him to that specific animal. The reunion was emotional for everyone present. The cat, who had been unresponsive and withdrawn, immediately recognized his owner and began purring for the first time since arriving at the shelter. The man, who had lost his home and most of his possessions in the disaster, wept as he held his beloved pet, the only family he had left. "How did he know?" the man asked Grace, looking at Scout with wonder and gratitude. "How did that dog know Charlie was mine?" Grace didn't have a scientific answer, but she had learned to accept that Scout's abilities transcended normal understanding. "Sometimes the most important connections can't be explained," she replied. "They can only be experienced and appreciated." The disaster response mission lasted 6 weeks, during which Second Chance helped reunite over 300 pets with their families and provided medical care for hundreds more animals. Their temporary shelter became a model for disaster response that other organizations studied and replicated. The operation's success led to invitations to assist with animal welfare components of disaster response plans in multiple states. Returning home from the deployment, Grace felt a profound sense of pride in what their team had accomplished. But she also noticed that Scout seemed more tired than usual, moving more slowly and sleeping longer than had been his habit. The veterinary examination revealed no serious health issues, just the normal aging process for a dog who had lived an extraordinarily active and purposeful life. Maya, now 14 and already thinking about veterinary school, took on increased responsibility for Scout's care. She monitored his diet and exercise carefully, ensuring that he remained comfortable while still being able to participate in the work that gave his life meaning. The bond between the teenager and the aging dog had deepened over the years, built on mutual respect and shared dedication to animal welfare. Lucas, approaching 12, had begun documenting Scout's training methods and behavioral insights, creating a manual that could help other animal welfare organizations benefit from the dog's unique abilities. His detailed observations and careful documentation showed a scientific mind that would serve him well in whatever career path he eventually chose. As autumn arrived again, marking nearly 6 years since their initial encounter with Scout, Grace organized another anniversary celebration for Second Chance. The event had grown into a major community gathering, with hundreds of people attending to celebrate the organization's achievements and support its ongoing mission. The celebration included demonstrations of their various programs, tours of the expanded facilities, and presentations about their research partnerships and educational initiatives. Scout, moving more slowly but still engaged with visitors, served as the unofficial host, greeting familiar faces and welcoming newcomers with his characteristic grace and dignity. During her remarks to the gathered crowd, Grace spoke about the importance of paying attention to opportunities for compassion, even when they come in unexpected forms. "6 years ago, my children and I heard a dog whimpering in an alley," she said, looking toward Scout, who was resting in his favorite spot near the podium. "We had no idea that stopping to help one injured animal would lead to all of this." She gestured toward the facilities around them, the staff and volunteers who made their work possible, and the families who had found beloved pets through their adoption programs. "But maybe that's the most important lesson Scout has taught us. You never know where a single act of kindness might lead." The celebration concluded with the announcement of their latest project, a partnership with the local school district to develop a curriculum that would teach children about animal welfare, environmental stewardship, and the importance of community service. Maya and Lucas would serve as student consultants for the program, sharing their unique perspective as young people who had grown up immersed in rescue work. As the guests departed and the staff began cleaning up from the event, Grace found herself alone with Scout in the quiet facility. The dog approached her slowly, his movements careful but determined, and settled down beside her chair in the gesture that had become their ritual for important conversations. "We've come a long way from that alley, haven't we?" she said softly, stroking his graying coat. "Further than I ever could have imagined." Scout's response was a gentle sigh of contentment, his eyes closing peacefully as he rested his head on his paws. In that moment, Grace felt a deep sense of gratitude not just for the financial treasure they had discovered, but for the journey of service and compassion that Scout had initiated by simply trusting them to help him when he was hurt and alone. The years ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities, new animals to help, and new families to serve. But the foundation they had built together, guided by Scout's wisdom and example, would continue to grow and evolve, touching lives in ways they were only beginning to understand.